Hello, everybody. Ben here from All Sociology. Strap yourselves in. This is going to be a long video. This one is all about social class and achievement differences. This is specifically for you A-level sociologists out there doing the AQA specification. So today's video, like I say, it is going to be a long one. You might want to split this one up into a few different parts. You may want to come back to it at various different points. But what I'm hoping to do with you in today's video is to run through pretty much an awful lot of stuff that you're going to need to know in order to help yourselves through if you get any questions in the exam on social class and achievement. So what I'm going to do with you, as per usual, is I'm going to share my screen. You should in any moment now be able to see me up in my corner up there, and you should be able to see the agenda of what we want to try and do in today's video. So as you can see, we're going to try and go through lots of different stuff today. I'm going to start off with a little bit of context for you. We're going to look at some things that can affect social class achievement that happen outside of school, so externally or at home, in terms of both cultural factors and material factors, although not in that order. We're going to look at some things that can go on in school, so some internal factors, and then we'll finish up with a bit of a look at a previous exam question, and hopefully by the end of this video, you will be fairly comfortable in being able to answer all of those videos. Now, a couple of things to say before I get started in earnest. The first thing to say is this is intended as a revision video. Lots of this stuff will be stuff hopefully that you've already learned as you've gone through your A-level lessons and lectures and those kind of things. But please don't fret if I go over stuff that perhaps you haven't learned. There are loads of different things you can talk about in this. I've tried to not cover absolutely everything. I'd be here all blimmin' day. I've just tried to cover some of the main points and what I think that most of you would have come across in your lessons and things like that. Also, to say as well, please, if you haven't already, go back and watch the first one of these A-level sociology videos. That will go over some context for you with social class and give you a bit of a better understanding about the situation. But without further ado, let's get into this, what we need to look at today. So I am going to start off today with a little bit of kind of contextual information, looking at social class. So what is social class? If you've watched the previous video, you'll know about this. Social class basically refers to someone's what we call socioeconomic background. Pretty much this is something we can measure based on somebody's household income. So when it comes to students, we're looking at the amount of money your parents get from their job or jobs, and that then determines your social class. But that's not the only thing to know about social class. In fact, social class is far more about other factors as well as what you earn or how much your parents earn. So it is a broader term than that. It's just the way we measure it is done on household income. Whoops-a-daisy. Now, the reason why this is important is that social class has the biggest impact on how likely a student is to achieve at school and in education. But it's well worth saying that social class intersects with both ethnicity and gender as well. And I'm going to do a couple of videos in the future. One will be completely on ethnicity, one will be completely on gender. But as much as these things can be taken as three separate things, class, ethnicity, gender, they do interlock and overlap and intersect with one another. So just be aware of that as we go through today. Why does this all matter? Well, if you've watched the previous video to this one that gives you a bit of context, you'll know that pupils from a lower working class backgrounds are eligible for free school meals. Basically, I believe that is any student whose family household income amounts to less than £17,000 a year at time of recording. And we know that those pupils who get free school meals or FSM are 30% less likely to gain good GCSEs in English and maths compared to everyone else who isn't eligible to get those free school meals. So there is a big achievement gap between the lower working classes and the basically everybody else, but most notably the middle class as well. The other thing I think that's important to say is that as much as what I'm going to run through with you today is based on differences between pupils from different social class backgrounds from within state schools, so differences between working class and middle class students, there is also, of course, those students who do pay for their education to go to what we call independent schools. So this can be private schools. It can even be those very prestigious, very well established historically public schools as well. And if you are somebody who can afford to go to those, you'll almost certainly like to be middle class, and you are far more likely to get top A-level grades as well. Now, the other thing to say is these patterns of achievement are pretty much the same over time as well. So these are historically big kind of gaps between the working class achievement and middle class achievement. So it's quite a big, useful, interesting thing to delve into. And that's why today's video is going to take quite a long time to go through. So why is there this difference then between working class students from those lower socioeconomic backgrounds and middle class students? There are loads of explanations. And the thing I'm going to come back to time and time again is that you need to be thinking about a combination of these different factors. Basically, there is to do with external factors, so stuff that goes on outside of school, at home, in the family. We can split those factors into what we call material and cultural. I'll run through that with you in a bit more detail in a moment. As well as what goes on outside of school, there are some things that go on in schools as well. So these all kind of club together and mesh together to offer us a holistic explanation for why working class students don't achieve as well as middle class students in school. Now, it is crucial to say for you that if you are looking at those higher grades, if you're looking at getting A stars, A's, even B's, you do want to be making that connection between these different factors, and also understanding that social class can also be affected by somebody's gender and somebody's ethnicity as well. So that's a bit of a background for you. But let's start to get into some of the big issues with this. And specifically, we're going to start off by looking at external material factors. So these are things that go on outside of school, at home. And what we mean by material factors is basically anything that's associated with money and physical things that money can buy. Now, this could well be to do with the fact that working class people and families have lower incomes, meaning they've got less money to spend on educational resources and school supplies. So classic examples of things like this might be middle class students might be able to afford private tutors, personal laptops, being able to go on expensive school trips and stuff like that. All of these things can increase somebody's chance of achieving well at school, whereas working class families may not have that disposable income to spend on those educational resources and supplies and things like that. Now, when we talk about students who perhaps lack that material ability, that money and the things that money can buy, we might use the phrase material deprivation. It's a phrase used by the sociologist Douglas to describe the fact that some students, working class students, go without that money and the things that that money can buy as well. So that's a bit of an overview as to what we really mean by material factors that go on at home. Now, I'm not really going to focus too much massively on income levels, but I'm going to focus on the things that money can buy. And whilst we can talk about resources and stuff like that, that's useful to know, but the more interesting meaty factors I think to speak about are things like housing. So if you've got more money, you can afford a better house. If you've got less money, you perhaps won't be able to afford a better house. What do we mean by a better house? Well, somewhere where pupils and students have got their own space to revise, they've got more quiet spaces, maybe even a home office, their own revision room, something like that. If you perhaps lack that material to buy a decent house or rent a decent house, your housing is likely to be cramped. This might then mean that there's less room to study. You won't have as many places to revise. It won't be as quiet. Perhaps you're sharing a bedroom with an older or younger sibling, which you might know if you do that yourself, how disruptive that can be to your revision. So all of these things are going to be difficult for working class pupils because of the quality of housing they've got. So working at home is going to be much tougher than it is for a middle class student, for instance. Now, this whole issue of housing is something we really associate with a sociologist called Washbrook. They also not only look at cramped housing, we also look at damp housing. Now, damp is basically a problem that lots of houses, particularly poorer quality houses, have, and it basically is mold growing within your house. Now, if you are living in one of these sort of lower quality houses, and you're living in a situation where there's mold in the house, you breathing that mold in is not going to be good for your health. It's going to lead to illness. If you're ill, then the chances are you're going to have time off school. If you have time off school, you're going to miss some of the content that perhaps you might need to know for your exams. And you can see the way that sort of we can build that chain of reasoning between living in a damp house, how it can lead to illness, how illness can lead to absence. And as a result of that, then you're going to miss content. And if that content crops up in the exams, well, I guess you're kind of screwed, aren't you? Because you weren't there for it unless you've caught up on it and those kind of things. Now, the other thing to say about housing as well is that it's not just the quality, how big the house is, whether it's nice and dry, it's also about where the house is. So we talk about this as catchment area in terms of where the house is in relation to good or outstanding schools. Now, if we look at it the other way, 90% of failing schools, so schools that are judged to be failing by Ofsted, are seen to be in what we call deprived areas, so lower socio-economic background areas. Middle-class families can afford to move into more expensive areas. That allows them to be closer to those better schools. The closer you are to one of those better schools, the chances are the better quality of education you're going to get. And because school catchment areas basically raise the prices of houses in those areas, we can talk about middle class families and students being able to afford to live in those areas. We talk about this as selection by mortgage. So if you are applying to go to a secondary school, for instance, and it's a good school, the chances are it's going to be oversubscribed. So the schools will need to make choices between which types of students they pick in order to go to that school. One of the factors that influence how you are more likely to get into that school is your catchment area. And in those catchment areas, the houses are more expensive. And one of the things that drives up the prices of those more expensive houses is the catchment area to the local school. So housing issues, lots of things you can talk about with that. They are things you can touch, of course. You can touch your house, and therefore it's a material factor. And we associate those ideas primarily with a sociologist called Washbrook. But it's not just housing, it's also about the food that you might be eating as well. And now these ideas are wholeheartedly associated with a sociologist called Marilyn Howard. We can basically say on a very simple level that working class families may be less able to afford nutritious, healthy, vitamin enriched foods and lifestyles. And as a result, one of the things that can lead to, again, is illness. So if you've got a really poor diet, low levels of nutrition, that might weaken your immune system, again, leading to illness, leading to absence, missing some of that content from school. But not only that as well, we can think about, if you're thinking about like nutrition and diet, thinking about like eating organic vegetables and fruit, having your 5 a day, drinking lovely sort of delicious vitamin rich smoothies, those things are expensive, and these are things that perhaps working class families are less able to afford versus other types of food. Now, if you've got lots of vitamins going into your body, that's going to help your concentration in class. It's going to increase the amount you are able to pay attention in class. If you don't have that, the likelihood is you'll be less able to concentrate in class, ultimately missing some of that content. And so we can see there some interesting ideas about material deprivation amongst working class families and pupils that might cause them to underachieve at school. So there are some material factors. All of that stuff, we can touch money, we can touch houses, we can touch the food that we put into our bodies. Therefore, it is a material factor. But as I mentioned, external factors don't just focus on material things, they also focus on cultural factors as well. So what we mean by cultural factors is anything associated with your background and identity. These are things that generally you can't touch. They're not tangible, they're not material, but they are really associated with things that might be part of your identity and your background that might influence you to do well or perhaps less well at school. Now, for many sociologists, some would argue, what we call cultural deprivation theorists would say that working class families and pupils maybe lack the cultural tools that are necessary for educational success. And if you are culturally deprived, it's a fairly common phrase that's used amongst sociologists. It means to go without these cultural tools. So what do we kind of mean by this? Well, basically, there's things like values. So whether your family and you value education, the level of education that your parents might have, the type of language that you speak and the way in which you speak, levels of aspirations perhaps your parents or family might have for you, as well as things like Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital. Now, I'm going to go through a few of these things with you today. I can't cover all of them because we'll be here all flipping day, but hopefully some of these things are going to ring a bell for you as we go through. So let's focus on one of the big kind of ideas from cultural deprivation theorists, people like Douglas, for instance, who would say that working class families perhaps don't socialize their children into educational values, things that are going to be useful for them to care about education and want to do well and want to achieve at school. Now, I'm going to look at two big kind of ideas with this, really. First of all, we're going to look at Sugarman's ideas of what he calls working class subcultural values. So Sugarman has got this view that working class families have particular types of values that include the following things: fatalism, collectivism, present time orientation, and immediate gratification. So what do those things mean? Well, fatalism is basically this sense that you aren't in control of your own fate or your own destiny. It's like what will be, what happens, happens. There's nothing that I can do to change it. Sugarman would say that working class families socialize their kids into this idea. You can't really change your situation. It's just kind of what happens to you is how it kind of works. Collectivism, this is more about a focus on being part of a group, whether that's a group of friends or being close to your family, rather than actually looking at your own individual achievements or abilities that you might have. So focusing more on maybe being part of a peer group rather than focusing on your studies. And present time orientation and immediate gratification, they're kind of similar things. Present time orientation is about being focused on the here and now, the present, rather than looking towards the future. And immediate gratification, very much linked to that, is the idea that you want immediate gratification, immediate kind of rewards for what you're doing. So the classic example I always give with my students for these two things together is about like taking on a part-time job, or maybe looking at having a job straight after school rather than going to university. You're focused on like the here and now. I want money right now, rather than to go to university, pay money and get into debt, but potentially to get a higher salary later on. It's quite a nice way of explaining present time orientation. The opposite, as opposed to this, is about middle class families might have more of a deferred gratification, meaning you're going to put off gratification, i.e., feeling good about yourself and getting what you want in order to get a better quality of life later on down the line. And like I say, using the university example is quite a good one for this. Now, Barry Sugarman's not the only cultural deprivation theorist who focuses on socialization. We've also got the ideas of somebody like Douglas. And Douglas would argue that parents' own educational experiences will massively affect how well working class students do in education as well. So he might argue, for instance, that working class parents perhaps didn't have as good a time in education. They're then going to socialize their kids into it and say things like, you know, well, I never did work very well at school, but look at me, I'm doing all right now. And you don't really need to try hard in school, you'll be fine, these kind of things. So again, linked to that idea of fatalism that Sugarman talks about. So ultimately, you've got two sociologists there, Sugarman and Douglas, both cultural deprivation theorists who focus on the fact that working class families don't socialize their children into values and ways of being and thinking that are particularly useful for achieving at school. On the opposite side of it, you've got middle class families will probably want to encourage their children, have higher aspirations for them, and this increases their levels of achievement in school as well. Now, socialization isn't the only cultural factor we can talk about. I'm also going to talk a little bit with you about language, and I don't mean necessarily the language, whether English or French or those kind of things that you speak at home. I'm talking about the way in which you speak that language. So the idea we've got here is from a sociologist called Basil Bernstein, cracking name, right? And Bernstein says that the type of language used by working class pupils and working class families doesn't really match with the language used in schools by teachers, in textbooks, in exams, those kind of things. And as a result, working class language, there's like this mismatch between the language that working class students use and the language of schools, and it isn't particularly valued by the middle class nature of schools. So we've got two, sorry, that's my dog. You might hear him as we go through this. He's probably going to get a little bit annoyed with me talking into the computer rather than giving him cuddles. So I might even show you him as we go through the video. Anyway, enough about my dog. Let's talk about Bernstein. So basically, Bernstein's got these two concepts. Working class families have what he calls a restricted speech code or restricted language code. What that means is that working class families use short, uncomplex, unarticulate sentences, whereas middle class students and families use a far more what he calls elaborated or elaborate speech code or language code. This is where you use more complex sentences, greater extent of grammatical structure, more articulacy, all of those kind of nice ways in which your language might build up over time, and as a result might help you with things like writing an English essay, for example. So you've got different ways of speaking at home that, again, cultural, you can't touch speech or language or these kind of things, but the ways in which working class students are brought up might lend themselves to not doing as well in education, whereas the way middle class students are brought up at home, it does help them with their schooling. So we can look at the ideas of language for both of those as well. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. We're going to move on from cultural factors. We're going to keep with external factors. But before I move on to internal factors, I want to do a little bit of a kind of an analysis and an evaluation of some of these ideas that we've looked at. So in any kind of essay question, the idea will be not only to recount some of this knowledge and show you understand it, apply it to the question, but also to analyze it and to evaluate what you've said as well. So it means really kind of looking at the other sides of things and what might be some of the problems with using these arguments to explain why working class students underachieve and why middle class students achieve particularly well. So the first sort of big thing we can talk about here is policies put forward by the government, UK government. And there's a really nice phrase you can use, which is compensatory educational policies. Compensatory educational policies are things like Sure Start children's centres, and these are policies that are put in place by the government to bridge the gap between deprived pupils, i.e. lower working class pupils, and everybody else. We've also got other things going on here as well, like pupil premium. So if you are a student that is of a lower socioeconomic background, the government will give your school money to pay for additional things that you might need as well. So that might be going on trips, it might be for, I don't know, laptops or technology or things like that that might help you with your homework at home. Also, EMA is educational maintenance allowance, doesn't exist anymore. This was something really from back in my day, like the early 2000s, where students were kind of paid to carry on going to further education, so going to sixth form or college, as opposed to going out into the workplace when you could do that at age 16. And the idea was to encourage students from lower working class backgrounds to carry on in education rather than having that immediate gratification of going out and getting a job. So a little bit about compensatory educational policies. The best one to use there is Sure Start Children's Centres, which worked in deprived areas to give those students who were much, much younger, so we're talking really from, I suppose, from birth really up until before you go to primary school, giving them some additional support to hopefully bridge that gap between the working classes and the middle class students. The other thing we can talk about in terms of policies is, I mentioned earlier, like one of the arguments we might look at, a material argument, is that working class students can't afford those nutritional and vitamin enriched diets and things like that. We've got free school meals. So students who, as I say, earn, I believe it's under £17,000, their families, if their income is below 17 grand a year, they'll be eligible for free school meals. And this policy is put forward by the government to aim to provide those pupils with sufficient amount of sustenance and nutrients. Now, whether you think that school dinners have that nutrients or vitamins, that's up to you. But the idea behind it is that all students can go to school and have a decent meal and be able to have one, even if they can't necessarily afford it because of their parents' income at home. What about some of these wider issues as well? Now, earlier on, we talked a little bit about cultural deprivation. Now, somebody like Nell Keddy would argue that cultural deprivation is a bit of a myth, and B, it's also kind of victim blaming. And what she means by that is that, like, this idea that working class culture is like inferior to middle class culture. It's not necessarily less valuable, it's just a different kind of culture to middle class culture. But cultural deprivation theorists, your likes of Sugarman and Bernstein, etc., they would very much see middle class culture as more valuable and useful and working class culture is inferior. But Keddy dismisses this, and what she says basically is it's actually not about cultural deprivation, it's about the fact that schools are prejudiced towards working class socialization values, language, and those kind of things. So this is quite a broad criticism that you can use against cultural deprivation. The other thing I think to say with this as well is that poverty is a broader issue and social problem to blame for some of these classes. And it's not that working class families don't want to provide their children with all of the kind of material advantages that middle class families have. It's that the system or the social structure that we live in is set up in a way that we've got a huge amount of poverty. So some people believe, according to charities like the Joseph Ramsey Foundation, we've got like 25 to 30% of people living in poverty in the UK. That's a broader issue rather than the idea that parents just don't want to spend money on their kids. And so it's important to make the point that many working class families make huge sacrifices for their kids' educations, working multiple jobs, trying to give their kids a better chance and a better future than perhaps they've had for themselves. So some different kind of ways we can evaluate those, both material deprivation ideas as well as cultural deprivation ideas as well. But the big point I want to make to you as well is that to really explain why working class students underachieve at school and why middle class students achieve, we've got to use a combination of those material factors, those cultural factors, as well as the internal factors, which is what we're going to look at in a minute. And lots of the stuff that goes on at home can heavily influence and overlap and intersect with how you might be treated in school, so internally. I think, despite having said that, I think the majority of people would agree that those material inequalities, like the differences between working class and middle class incomes, for instance, and the rates of poverty that go on in the country, have a huge impact on social class inequalities and achievement. So you can't dismiss material deprivation. Whether you agree with it or not is kind of up to you, but you cannot kind of argue about the fact that there is a huge material inequality in terms of working class families, particularly at the lower end of those, so the ones eligible for free school meals, and middle class families as well. So hopefully that gives you a broad idea of the ways that we can sort of criticize and evaluate some of those material and cultural deprivation ideas that we've looked at already. I'm going to take a quick sip of my coffee because this is going to be a long video. I'm going to need some caffeine to get me through, so excuse me. But what I'm going to do with you is just throw up onto the screen here, well, not actually throw up, but I'm going to put onto the screen here what we're going to go through next, which is going to be looking at internal factors. So, as I say, internal factors, what we mean by this is stuff that goes on inside school. And ultimately, there's a bunch of different things we can consider when we talk about internal factors. Most of it is going to look at what we call the relationships and processes that happen between pupils and teachers in school, but also the relationships and process that happen between peer groups, so between groups of students in school. Now, there's loads of different things we can talk about that go on in school. I haven't got time today, and you probably haven't got time today to go through absolutely everything. So I'm going to sort of hit a few kind of common ones, which will be about labeling, the organization of teaching and learning, that's T&L. So whether you're in sets, bands, streams, all that kind of stuff, pupil responses to labeling and setting and streaming, those kind of things. Identities and class identities is a key thing, as well as the formal and the hidden curricula. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on as we go through this. It's important to say that a lot of the evidence that's put forward that argue that the internal factors to education have the biggest impact on class differences are put forward by interactionist sociologists. So interactionists are sociologists that tend to study small groups, and the name kind of gives it away, the interactions that happen between, for instance, teachers and students. So labeling is your kind of classic example of the way in which the teacher-pupil relationships might happen. Ultimately, how do labels come about? They arise from expectations that teachers might have about certain students. Those expectations might lead to labels. So your classic one being, you're a bright pupil, you're not so bright pupil, or you're able, or you're less able, for instance. This can also influence what we call the halo effect. So the halo effect is where you're labeled for one thing, and that label carries over to something else. So the example I always give for this is thinking about how maybe you've been labeled as a badly behaved student. That's one label, but that label of being badly behaved transfers over to, this is somebody who's not a particularly high achiever or not particularly bright. So you're looking at two separate things there. This is an idea by Becker, who I'm going to mention in a minute. The halo effect being labeled for one thing, let's say your behavior, but that label carries over to another kind of dimension of your character, like your ability to achieve. Behavior hasn't really got there's not a huge link between those two things, but the halo effect means you get labeled for one thing, that carries over to something else as well. And then we've also got the self-fulfilling prophecy, or a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if your teacher has particular expectations of you, let's say they expect you to do well, they might label you as really bright. They might then give you this idea, this halo effect idea of being a bright, well-behaved, well-presented student. You then start to believe that label that's been bestowed upon you. So the self-fulfilling prophecy is where you believe the label that's been given to you. That then affects your confidence. If you've been labeled well, you're going to probably achieve really well. That's going to help you out. You're probably going to ask for more help from your teachers. Your teachers are going to see you're interested. That's going to ultimately help you achieve higher. But if it works the other way, let's say you've been labeled as badly behaved or an underachiever or not particularly bright, you then might start to believe that. As a result, you then don't ask for help. You don't try particularly hard at school. And it's about those labels, those predictions or expectations that teachers have, you believing them, those coming true, and ultimately affecting your achievement levels at school as well. So for the biggest person we can talk about with labeling is Howard Becker, brilliant sociologist, absolutely love him, he's amazing. And what he argues is he says that middle class pupils are most closely resemble the image of what teachers have as an ideal pupil. So an ideal pupil would be someone who is working hard, who behaves themselves, and also looks the part as well. So Becker said that teachers label pupils according to conduct, work, and appearance, and that's what the ideal pupil is. And ultimately, middle class pupils most closely resemble that image that teachers have of the ideal or perfect pupil. Now, another study that focuses on labeling and the way in which labels can lead to self-fulfilling prophecies is conducted by Dunn and Gaisley. Now, I find this one particularly interesting because ultimately what they argue is that schools reproduce working class underachievement by labeling. And what basically happens is teachers label students and they base these labels on how interested they think their parents are. So, for instance, let's say like a middle class student gets labelled as bright or able because their parents always turn up to parents' evening. Maybe they make contact with the school. Maybe they're interested in how their child is getting on. They pay for clubs and school trips and things like that. And as a result, teachers then start to treat you differently based on how interested they think that your parents are in your own education. Now, I find this one particularly interesting because it works really well in terms of class, because it's the idea that teachers have this huge impact on reproducing working class underachievement, and on the other side of that coin, helping reproduce middle class achievement in terms of school and exams and things like that. Now, labeling, expectations, self-fulfilling prophecies, all that good stuff, it's also linked to what we talk about when we say the organization of teaching and learning in school. Now, basically what this means is the way that schools set themselves up and how they set themselves up to teach pupils. Now, most commonly we're talking about things like setting, but also banding and streaming. So setting is where you're put into ability groups for just certain subjects like maths, for instance. Banding and streaming basically means the same thing. It's where you're put into ability groups for all of your subjects as well. Now, one of the classic studies in relation to banding is Stephen Bull's study on Beachside Comprehensive School. And he argues that middle class pupils are most likely to be in the top bands. And as a result, they are warmed up. They're given more to do. Their teachers are encouraging them more. They're wanting them to go on after finishing school, to go to college, go to university, get top jobs and all these kind of things. Conversely, your working class students, they're more likely to be in the lower bands. Remember, this is for every single subject. And they are, how he describes it, they're cooled down. So what he means by this is that they're not given as much to do, they are, less is expected of them, and they're sort of encouraged to leave school at the earliest opportunities. And so by this kind of process of being put into these different groups, this way that school is organized, you've got issues of labeling going on here, but it's also impacting on self-fulfilling prophecy. So these ideas often kind of like flow into one another. So that's Stephen Bull's study. Similar study done by Nell Keddy. She looked at streaming. So streaming and banding, basically the same thing. She just uses the phrase streaming as opposed to banding. And what she argues is that lower stream pupils are given unequal access to classroom knowledge. So basically they're taught less, less is expected of them. And as a result of being taught less, they've got less to work with those working class students, less able to achieve those higher grades. And this might also be an explanation as to why certain working class students don't achieve as well as middle class students, because they're given less to do. And ultimately we might think about the relationship between banding and setting in terms of what tier of exam paper you're entered for. So obviously if you're entered into a, let's say, foundation tier for maths, you are unable to get, I think it's above a grade 5 at GCSE, whereas if you're in a higher tier and you're entered into a higher tier paper, your achievement ceiling is all the way up to a 9, whereas if you're in that foundation tier, you're limited at or capped at a grade number 5. Now, the final study I wanted to just mention to you in terms of organisation of teaching and learning is Gilborn and Udell's concept of the educational triage and the A to C economy. So this isn't necessarily like as formalized as like setting or banding, but Gilborn and Udell claim that teachers kind of split students into 3 kind of categories. This is what we mean by a triage. So you've got 3 categories based on how teachers think students are going to achieve. So you've got the the ones that are going to achieve anyway. So let's use the old language of like A star, A and B students. No matter what you do, how you teach them, they're going to achieve anyway. So it doesn't really matter like how much effort or attention is placed into them. You just want to keep pushing them to make sure they get the top grades. You've then got like the CD borderline students, and now these ones are really, really important for schools because schools get judged basically on achievement levels, and to get a grade C, or in today's money like a grade 5 or 4 or above, that's what really helps schools out in the league table. Now teachers, according to Gilborn and Udell, spend most of their time focusing on pushing those top end students who are going to pass anyway to get the top grades, but also helping those students who are on that CD borderline to get from a D to a C to help the school in its position in the league table. Now, it just so happens that the majority of students who end up in that top category of going to achieve anyway are your middle class students. Your CD borderline is a mix of middle class and working class students. But the group of students that don't really get any help, according to Gilborn and Udell's educational triage, are your working class students who fall into the category of basically below a D grade, and they're described as hopeless cases by Gilborn and Udell. And so teachers think, oh, they're going to fail anyway. There's no point putting any time or effort into them. What's the point in helping them? And because the fact that they're more likely to be working class students in that hopeless case category, they're going to get less help, less support, so that really without a hope of actually getting those top grades or even a grade C or 4 or 5 at GCSE. So what does that mean in terms of the A to C economy? The A to C economy is just the phrase they use to talk about the fact that schools focus on getting students those A star, A, B, and C grades, because those are the ones that go into the league tables that make the school look good. There's no point, according to them, teachers working hard with your D grade and below students, because they don't go into league tables. They don't help the school look particularly good. And so ultimately, there's no point really helping them out. Hopefully that makes a bit of sense. We've gone through a lot of different ideas there, but as I say, labeling, expectations, self-fulfilling prophecies, they also tie into the way that schools are organized in terms of their teaching and learning, whether that be banding and setting, or indeed in terms of those more informal groups of educational triage as put forward by Gilborn and Udell. Quick sip of coffee for me. That's delicious. Let's talk a little bit more about other stuff that goes on in schools. So let's talk about subcultures, right? So loads of studies done on subcultures and social classes. What I'm going to try and do here is just go over a few key studies and link these into social class. So you've got Lacey's seminal study, and he talks about subcultures arise from what he calls differentiation. Differentiation can be through teachers labeling students in a particular way, or setting them or streaming them in different groups. And the ways that you're differentiated, you're treated differently, whether that be according to a label or a set or whatever, that then leads to what he calls polarization. So polarization, two opposite ends of the spectrum. And those two opposite ends of the spectrum are really what we can refer to in quite simple terms as anti-school or pro-school subculture. So pro-school subculture, conform to all the values, want to achieve, want to do well, behave yourself. Anti-school subcultures, none of that stuff at all. Don't conform to school values, don't want to do well, don't want to achieve, don't want to get on, probably just there to muck about and those kind of things. So Lacey's study, very simplistic, two groups of students that get polarized according to how they're differentiated. This leads us on to saying that that is quite a simplistic way of looking at how subcultures and subcultural responses arise in terms of teacher labeling or differential treatment. A way better study, I think, is from Marsh and Mack and Gale. And Mack and Gale talks about the fact that there is a range of different subcultural responses amongst working class pupils. It's not that they all fall into these anti-school subcultures, which is effectively what Lacey's kind of saying. What you've got here is you've got a whole range of different subcultural responses to the education system, going from your anti-school subcultures, which Mack and Gale refers to as macho lads, but you've also got working class students who fall into pro-school subcultures as well. So pro-school subcultures in terms of wanting to achieve, but having that working class identity as well. So he looks at two different types. He looks at the new enterprises. New enterprises are basically working class students who are taking vocational qualifications and wanting to achieve in those qualifications. Specifically, when Mack and Gale was doing this study in the early 1990s, it was things like computing and stuff like that. But also you've got your academic achievers, students going down a more kind of academic route and wanting to achieve in terms of that. But they are two or three different types of working class subcultural responses. Macho lads, new enterprises and academic achievers, very, very different responses to teaching and learning within school. Now, the other study I wanted to quickly cover off is Paul Willis's Learning to Labour, which is a classic sociological study. His study is interesting because it's nothing to do with labeling. So the other ones we can look at there with Lacey, Mack and Gale, often those subcultural responses occur as a result of labeling. Willis's study has got nothing to do with labeling. It's more about the rejection of middle school values by working class anti-school subcultures, or the lads, as he called them, or they called themselves. So this is not about labeling. It's about the fact that working class kids in Willis's study, all the way back in the 1970s, didn't care for school, didn't want to do well, because all they wanted to do was get working class jobs like their dads had got in factories, and their dads were kind of socializing them into this idea that they don't really need to try hard at school. You know, why do I need Shakespeare or algebra to go and work in the car factory? And my dad got a job there really easily. There's no reason I shouldn't get that as well. It's just rejecting those middle class school values because they come from a working class background. So there's a little bit of stuff about Willis's study there. The other thing to say is that in terms of like contemporary application, perhaps this wouldn't work as well today, purely because of the fact that the UK economy has reduced its amount of manufacturing jobs that we have. We've gone through a process of what we call deindustrialization, and so things like that just wouldn't kind of happen these days. Now, something else is social class identity. So social class identity is about how you see yourself, and a key study here is by Louise Archer. Her big shtick is basically the idea that schools have what she calls a middle class habitus, and habitus is like the ways of thinking and acting according to a particular social class. Schools have a very middle class habitus, and it conflicts with the working class habitus that working class students come from in terms of their backgrounds and their identity. So there's like a clash of cultures in some ways. So habitus is a idea that's put forward originally by Pierre Bourdieu, and Archer borrows quite a lot of Bourdieu's ideas, most notably habitus, but also in terms of things like symbolic capital and symbolic violence as well. Now, what Archer found in her study was that working class pupils felt that they needed to kind of either change their identities, so change their working class identities if they wanted to get on and do well in school. So that might be in terms of how they speak or how they present themselves, how they dress in order to succeed, or you're not going to achieve well at school. So there's again this clash between the habitus of middle class schools and working class identities. And ultimately, what Archer found is that working class students don't want to kind of give up their working class identities. They don't want to change who they are. And as a result, working class students, what she describes as is they self-exclude from school. So they don't try, they don't want to do particularly well, and they get involved with what we call symbolic violence, which is basically clashing with the values of the school. Now, one way this happens is through her concept of Nike identities. And Nike identities is basically about the way that working class students, because of their class background, they don't feel like it's accepted or valued by the middle class habitus of the school. What they do, because they can't gain status in school based on who they are, what they do is they invest heavily in their ways that they dress. And often this will involve wearing sportswear, so Nike sportswear, Adidas, that kind of stuff. And ultimately, this causes further clashes with schools because of getting into trouble, going against school rules, not obeying uniform policies and things like this. And it creates a sense of what she describes as symbolic violence. And symbolic violence is not physical violence. It's just about the way that middle class culture devalues and doesn't value working class culture and habitus. And there again is this clash between middle class values of school and the working class identity and habitus of working class students, leading to underachievement. Now, the last thing I want to mention with internal factors is just talking about the curriculum. So what is taught in school, both formally, and lots of Marxists particularly would argue that the formal curriculum is like irrelevant to working class pupils. But most importantly, it's looking at the role of the hidden curriculum. So whenever we're talking about class, there will always be a role to discuss what Marxists say. Your classic Marxists from A-Level Sociology would be somebody like Bowles and Gintis with their correspondence principle. principle. And what their argument is basically is that schools, through the hidden curriculum, through the values, through the ethos, through the socialization process, they operate to prepare working class pupils to become an obedient workforce. So being taught rules, being taught sanctions that encourages us all to sort of do what we're told in order to basically get us ready for a life working in capitalism. And so by what they mean by the correspondence principle is the values and the things we're taught in school corresponds or matches to what we're going to need to know when we get out, leave school, and go into the capitalist workforce. Now, when they were writing, what their idea is really is they're looking again at some of these sort of working class factory jobs where working class people end up going into these boring, repetitive jobs where they do the same thing day in, day out. But the key thing is that the capitalists need obedient workers, people who aren't going to kick off, they're going to conform to values and norms and do as they're told. So that kind of, I hope, sort of covers some key internal factors that go on in school. We want to evaluate some of this stuff first of all before we move on. I should mention as well that, like, if you've got any questions about this stuff, throw them in the comments. I'll do my very best to read them and reply to you as best as I can. But let's have a think about how we can criticize some of these ideas that we've put forward. I mean, the first thing to say is that a lot of these ideas that focus on internal factors within school, you could just say, well, they're very negative, and not all teachers treat the working class and the middle class in the ways that have been outlined by interactionists. For instance, we can use some sociological theory here by considering what functionalists argue, that schools are meritocratic places where everyone gets the same chance of doing well, and that if you work hard, you'll get rewarded with good grades. It shouldn't matter what social class you are. It's about up to you and how hard you work and what effort you're willing to put into your schoolwork. And the other thing is, as well, is that like lots of schools put in place what we call interventionist strategies, whether this is like extra sessions, homework club, revision sessions, to support students who perhaps aren't performing as well as they would like to. So we've got things going on within school that perhaps I suppose, give shine a more positive light on some of the things that we've spoken about already in terms of negative labeling, setting being kind of the be all and end all and those kind of things. Now, as I mentioned before, a lot of the ideas that are put forward from looking at internal factors being problematic are put forward by interactionist sociologists. Now, we can criticize their research methods, first of all, by thinking about the fact that they're very small scale and they're kind of not very representative in terms of applying to everybody, and they can't really be generalized to everybody. It's only like a snapshot of what interactionists see within their study. So with Paul Willis's study, he is coming at it from a Marxist background, but it's very much an interactionist method. He just looked at, I think, like one school. I think it was 12 students he looked at. This is not representative of all working class students. And again, Stephen Bull, in his study on banding, just focused on one school in one particular part of the UK in one particular year. So whilst they're really useful studies, they're seminal studies to know about, you can easily criticize the methods that the sociologists used and applied when actually conducting that sociological research. And I think it's important to remember as well here that if we're thinking about labeling, teacher expectations and the way that students respond to those expectations, there are always a range of different responses that pupils can have to their relationships they have with their teachers. So not all of those labels are deterministic. They don't always lead to automatically to success or failure. You don't have to believe the label. You don't have to live up to it. You can indeed choose to reject a label that's given to you because you want to prove your teacher wrong. There are a whole range of different responses in terms of subcultural responses and responses to teacher expectations and labeling and those kind of things as well. So those labels aren't necessarily deterministic. The student does have the agency in terms of how they choose to respond to those things. Now, the ultimate thing, if you are ever writing about the role of social class and achievement at school, is, again, I'm going to come back to this a lot, it's about looking at combinations of different factors. So don't just put all your eggs into the internal factors basket. Don't put all into the external factors basket. Do a bit of both, a bit of a combination, but be aware that those things interact with each other as well. So relationships and processes in schools don't just occur within a vacuum. They are heavily influenced by what goes on outside of school. And those internal factors are also overlapping with one another. So I think this is why Dunn and Gaisley's study is really useful for this, because those labels that teachers developed, they were ultimately as a result of their expectations they had about how interested those students' parents were. So thinking about the external factor, the role of the parents influencing the perception that a teacher has of how likely that student is to achieve, based not on the student, but on how interested they see their parents as well. And we can think about this as well in relation to all of those kind of external factors and internal factors as well. Also, I'm going to mention this a few times, is that don't overlook the intersection of class with ethnicity and gender. I'm going to do a couple of videos in the near future, one on ethnicity, one on gender. Class doesn't exist, again, in a vacuum. There are issues that might be pertinent more to ethnic groups or to different genders that can intersect with class as well. So make sure if you're looking at those higher order skills, if you're aiming for the real top grades, A stars, A's, whatever else, that you are bringing in these combination of internal, external factors, the overlap between them, as well as considering how class intersects with gender and ethnicity. Right, let's have a look at an exam question. So this question came from 2018. It's from A-Level paper 1. Always education will be paper 1. And let's have a look at what this exam question says. So genuine exam question, 30 marks, apply material from item B and your own knowledge, evaluate sociological explanations of social class differences in educational achievement. The item reads as follows. Social class differences in educational achievement are found at all stages of the education system, and sociologists have put forward several explanations for these differences. Some sociologists focus on factors outside of school, such as the material circumstances of pupils' families or the ways in which parents socialize their kids. Other sociologists see factors internal to the education system as responsible. However, it can be argued that it is the interaction between these external and internal factors that produces class differences in educational achievement. Now, within that item, there are lots of things that you could potentially talk about that hopefully I've mentioned in this video today. We've got some stuff around material factors. We've got some stuff around factors internal to the education system, as well as the interaction between those factors. Let's have a think about how you could go about answering this essay. Now, remember with this, there are loads of different ways to cut this essay up. It's not one particular way of doing it. This is just the way that I would do it based on the stuff that I've gone through with you in today's video. So let's say you are sitting in the exam hall, or you've got this sort of question from your teacher at college or whatever. How does your essay want to look to get those top band marks? Ultimately, you want an introduction. You want 6 paragraphs, ideally, with a mix of factors, internal, external, cultural, external material. You're going to need to evaluate within those paragraphs, and you're going to need to finish off with a conclusion. Let's have a think first of all about what we can take from this item. So the item says, sociologists focus on factors outside of school, so external factors such as the material circumstances of pupils. So this might lead ourselves into talking about differential income levels between working class and middle class students. It might allow us to talk about some of those issues that were put forward by Washbrook in terms of housing. So that might be in terms of having a cramped house, a damp house, or indeed about the catchment area where your house is and selection by mortgage. We've also got those ideas that go through from somebody like Marilyn Howard, who talks about the fact that middle-class families are more able to afford nutritious, vitamin-enriched diet and nutrition for their children, helping them to achieve higher levels of educational success. I hope you didn't hear my dog just sneeze just then. I'm going to show him to you in a minute. Anyway, my dog won't help you with this exam question. External cultural factors, it says some families or the ways in which parents socialize their children. So this is in the item, it's getting towards some of these less material, more cultural factors. Socialization, we went through Barry Sugarman's 4 different types of subcultural values. So again, we're looking at those 4 ideas there of Oh, blimey, I've forgotten now what I was talking about. It was instant gratification or immediate gratification, present time orientation, collectivism and fatalism. We've got the language differences in terms of how working class students might be socialized into what Bernstein refers to as a restricted language code versus middle class students being socialized into their elaborated language code. And also what Douglas says about parental values. Parents from middle class backgrounds being more encouraging, having higher aspirations for their children, and etc. In the item, we've also got this phrase: other sociologists see factors internal to the education system as responsible. So, what can we talk about with this? We've got labeling, that might come from Howard Becker. It could as well come from somebody like Dunn and Gaisley. We've got banding and setting, whether that's Ball or Keddy or indeed the A to C economy from Gilborn and Udell, which we spoke about earlier. Internally, also the way in which there's that clash between the middle class habitus of schools and the working class habitus of working class identities from Louise Archer. And then all of those different kind of subcultural or pupil responses from the ideas from Lacey, so differentiation and polarization, Marshall Mack and Gales, different types of working class responses from your macho lads all the way through to your vocational, those academic achievers and those new enterprises, looking at their vocational qualifications, or also Willis's classic study, looking at the lads and their rejection of middle class school values in favour of their working class values. But in the final sort of paragraph or sentence of that item, this is the kicker, I think. This is where you kind of what really separates a real top answer from a pretty good answer. And it mentions it can be argued that there is an interaction between external and internal factors. So with this, you've got to keep thinking about those combination of factors and how external factors might influence internal factors. So what did we speak about earlier on? We mentioned Howard Becker's image of the ideal pupil. One of those characteristics of an ideal pupil is appearance, so how your parents choose to present you before you go to school. That might have an effect on labeling. As we mentioned earlier already, Dunn and Gaisley's study about your teacher's assumptions or expectations about how interested middle class parents are compared to working class parents. It could be to do with the language that is being taught and you're using at home from people like Basil Bernstein. It could also be in terms of those working class subcultural values that Sugarman mentions. So again, fatalism, collectivism, present time orientation, immediate gratification. There we go. Got it better that time. Leading to negative responses to school. So the way that you're socialized at home affects how you are acting and behaving in school, and that also affecting perhaps labeling, setting, streaming, your educational triage grouping, those kind of things. And also using Louise Archer's concept of Nike identities, the clash between middle class habitus of schools and working class habitus, and that causing what she refers to as symbolic violence, where working class students feel they can't gain status in the way that school would like them to, so they gain status amongst their peer groups through wearing Nike sportswear and so on and so forth. So there's a whole range of different stuff that you could talk about that hopefully I've covered with enough detail in this video to help you out and reminded you of a few things. But ultimately, you want to be looking at a range of different factors: external material, external cultural, internal factors, but also if you're looking at those really high grades, you want to look at the interaction between those factors, how the external influences the internal, as well as how some of those things intersect and overlap, and as well considering the intersection between class, ethnicity, and gender. So we're at nearly an hour, which is about what I expected to be doing for this. I hope if you're still with me, fair play to you. Well done for getting this far. Let's just recap and go back over what we've covered in this video so far. So we started off with a bit of context, thinking about the fact that class is more than just about the money that you have or your family has, but also that class has the greatest impact on the likelihood you have of educational achievement. But we also need to remember that class does intersect with gender and ethnicity as well. And then we're going to look at those in the next couple of videos. In terms of how we explain why middle class students perform better than working class students, it's done through a combination of factors. Firstly, external material factors, so looking at the material deprivation of working class students, perhaps due to the income levels they have, the type of housing they have, thanks to somebody like Washbrook, or indeed the nutritional value of food that they get put into their bodies from people like Marilyn Howard. When it comes to cultural factors, these are less tangible things, you can't touch them, but we looked at the idea of cultural deprivation from Douglas, the ways that working class students perhaps socialized into subcultural values put forward by Sugarman, the fact that working class students perhaps aren't encouraged as much and given as high aspirations from their parents, from the likes of Douglas, and also about the language that's spoken at home, that elaborate code of the middle classes versus the restricted code of the working classes put forward by Basil Bernstein. We then went through quite a few different internal factors in school, looking at things like the relationship between teacher expectations and labels, halo effects, self-fulfilling prophecies from people like Becker and Dunn and Gaisley. We considered the way that the school is organized and the way it sets itself up in terms of its classes through things like banding and streaming and setting from Ball and Keddy, but also looking at that more kind of informal organization through the educational triage put forward by Gilbourne and Udell and how that ties into marketization and the A to C economy of schools. We considered responses that pupils might have to the way they're treated by teachers. So again, thinking that on a very basic level, Lacey's differentiation and polarization is very kind of rudimentary, very basic. We then considered a little bit more detail about what Mack and Gale might argue, that there is a range of working class subcultural responses. It's not that they automatically fall into anti-school rejection of school values and norms, although we also considered Willis's study, where it's nothing to do with labeling, it's more about working class students rejecting those middle class values and ideas of schools. We also considered Louise Archer's work on working class identities and the clash between working class habitus and middle class habitus of school, as well as the role of the formal and hidden curriculum as well. Last thing to say is that don't forget that there is that link between those internal and external factors. They overlap with each other. They are not distinct and independent from one another. So there we go. I hope that has been enough to give you a bit of a recap of this stuff. I've managed to do about an hour's worth of content on this. I have had my little dog here with me all the way through this. Pablo, do you want to come up, Pablo, and say hello? Come on then. Let's go and show you to everybody. Look, this is my dog. There he is. Say hello, Pablo. Hello, hello. There he goes. So, anyways, enough about the dog. I hope this has been useful for you. I'm sorry it's gone on for a long time, but the long and the short of it is that there's a lot to say. And that's a good thing because you're going to need to write a lot of different stuff if you get one of those 30-mark questions. As always, if you found this video helpful, please, please, please do one or two things or even both of them. Can you please put a like on it? Can you then recommend it to somebody else you know who does sociology? Of course, if it's helpful for you, please let somebody else know about it. I'd love for you to do that. The other thing to say is in future, we've got a couple more videos coming out. So the next one is going to be on ethnicity. We're going to look into some of these details and these issues again, but in a bit more detail specific to ethnicity. And then after that, I'm going to do one on gender for you. And that will hopefully cover off the key kind of social groups that you could get asked about in your A-level sociology exam when it comes to the achievement of different social groups. That being said, I'm done here right now. I'm going to go and finish my coffee and I'm going to give my dog a little cuddle because I've ignored him for the best part of an hour. Hope to see you on the other side. Well done on getting through it. I'll catch you again next time. See you later.